Alrighty, we're live.
And I refused to drop out until they fired me, and nobody had the heart to fire me. So then I ended up doing these because I was like, I'm gonna do some scenes with Brad Pitt. It's gonna be great, and so I did. It was fun.
And what was that like?
It was actually surprisingly easygoing. He's actually kind of a pretty fun, sort of easygoing guy. And it was there's some goofy scenes, so it didn't really take much from me. But the funny thing was, I was at pains to let him know that I wasn't an actor, lest he judge me by my acting. And so I just got into one of these really embarrassing scenarios where I said, Brad, I just want you to know that I'm actually not an actor, I'm a director. And of course, everyone says they're a director, not what it is that they do. So he's like, okay. And ever since then, I've had an aversion to getting into any kind of like embarrassing social interaction with movie stars. So like, I'll give you for instance, I've met Tom Hanks several times and we've had discussions and had dinner together and it's been enjoyable, but I'm sure he's got lots of people who've met him once or twice or three times even, and then they come up to him and kind of bother him. So once I was in this bookstore and I heard him come in because I know he was picking up a book and he was kind of a little, he was wearing the baseball cap and he was kind of, on the down low. And so I didn't know what to do because I didn't know if he was going to recognize me. And I couldn't stand that moment where his eyes passed across me and just didn't register any familiarity. That would be too embarrassing. And I also didn't want to go up and say, hey, it's Chris Weitz. We met at this and this and this. So instead I hid behind some shelves until he left the store.
That is intensely relatable. So it's funny that we should start here, but a lot of the people who are going to check this out, of course, there is legions of fans of both you and I, of course, worldwide. But let's assume that a lot of people who go to a acting academy in Australia are among the first people who are going to see this. And one of the things I found out when sort of doing a little prep that I didn't know is that actually acting goes a long way back in your family. Like you're not maybe the Barrymores, but you're almost there because your grandma was in films. Your mom has an Oscar nomination. Did I read this correctly?
That's true. My mom has an Oscar nomination and 2 Golden Globes. Yeah, well, so my grandma was brought to America. My grandma was Mexican. And when she was a schoolgirl, she was talent scouted by this man, Robert Flaherty, who had made a documentary called Nanook of the North. Anyway, he was...
Oh, really?
Famous documentary, actually.
Yeah.
Even though it sounds quite silly. And he was sent to Mexico to find the most beautiful girl in Mexico and give her a contract to be in movies, which ended up being my grandma. And so at age 17, she went to Hollywood to be in silent pictures. And she was also in Mexican film. She's on a Mexican stamp. She's like a big deal in Mexico. Until, of course, talkies came around. And so something very much like the film The Artist happened.
Oh, The Artist.
Wherein
right.
she couldn't really speak English without a very strong accent. And the way that my grandfather, who was a producer who was an executive at Universal at the time, managed to keep her there was to do Spanish language versions of films that were shooting in English, but to shoot them from midnight onwards on the same sets that they were shooting the American versions on. So my grandma's in a version of Dracula, which is on the same sets as the Bela Lugosi Dracula, but is in Spanish.
That's
So
amazing.
that's a strange cinematic curio. And then my mom, yeah, was in a film called Imitation of Life, for which she was nominated for an Academy Award, and then it sort of dies out with me and my brother. Actually, my brother still occasionally will do some acting, but nobody asks me anymore to do, understandably.
But I'm guessing that you do, I mean, with that background, you have to have a certain empathy for the actor's sort of role and what is asked of them in the making of films.
Yeah, I think. I mean, I think the thing that really gave me empathy was to be in front of the camera for the first time. The kind of painful self-consciousness that brought to me all of a sudden, and that's made me realize the circumstances under which we're expecting actors to do things. And I think like everybody going in, your notion of an actor is like someone who kind of just pretends and kind of fucks around in front of the camera for a while. But it's so much more complicated and difficult than that. Like especially in movies or television, where you expect someone to kind of do these emotional sprints and then stop and then do it again and then sort of put it away until you finish setting the lights again, then get back to the same state of mind or state of appearance that you were in beforehand and do it again. So it's a very tricky thing to do.
It always strikes me the thing that is so impossible and sort of sleight of handy about acting for me, and I think this again because I'm directing the guys in this show, is that you have to really sort of create a sense of character and a way they move and a way they think and a way they are in the world, and you have to respond very naturally to everything that happens as if you were that person, or the whole thing breaks or you feel stilted. And then when someone says something to you, you have to completely from that very natural, organic place, with no forethought, say exactly the words somebody else wrote down for you.
Right.
Like that magic thing is a strange conjuring trick.
Yeah, how to make something utterly unspontaneous feel spontaneous, or even be spontaneous in the moment. Yeah, it's very tricky. I think at its best, it's almost like a form of channeling. I think with some of the really great people I've worked with, like Sir Ben Kingsley, you really feel like when he's doing his thing, he is not there. There's some kind of, and he has that notion too, that he's kind of channeling somebody or something. So it's like I got to credit my wife for sort of noticing this, that some kind of actors are like shamans, right? They're doing that kind of job where you're accessing this something from out there. I mean, of course, there are all kinds of different actors. Of course, there are performers. They're like comic performers who are very clearly kind of hamming. There are people who are doing the kind of thing that I'm talking about, this weird shamanic thing. There are improvisers who are almost like jugglers. There are method actors who have done a deep dive into themselves and are kind of excavating some kind of inner turmoil. There's all kinds of ways of going about it. And some people just can't do it. I'm guessing that everybody who's here, because they've gotten to this stage, sort of can, right? But that like if you're just to throw a regular person in front of the camera and give them the lines and give them all the time in the world to prepare, they would still suck. And then there are people who can and I don't think that you can really like parse out what makes for a great performance in too technical a way, because it's like kind of like examining a joke. Like it vanishes once you start being too technical about it. But but I think you can sort of start to analyze what the challenges or the obstacles are, especially to sort of somebody acting in the kind of films that are made nowadays. I mean, one big thing I've been thinking about, just to sort of go off on a tangent, which I hope isn't too sort of off the plan, but I think that one of the big challenges to a contemporary actor is, given how much is done on CGI now, is almost in a way a very old-fashioned kind of challenge, which is because it goes back to like the play of childhood, which is like, how do you behave towards something that's not there? And you wouldn't really have said that of acting, film acting in the 60s, 50s or 60s or 70s, 80s, 90s, but now, sort of directing things which have CG elements, you're constantly having to ask of actors that they act against nothing, or against some notion that they're creating in their own mind, or against a sort of concept art thing, or against a sort of a stuffed, green thing that is supposed to be a sort of creature of fearsome power, or what have you. And as well, I wouldn't be surprised if we find, unfortunately, that a lot of movies are being put together the way that like Avengers Endgame is, where it's like, well, this guy's schedule says that he can only shoot in July, but the person he's acting opposite isn't available then. However, we can get them in the set or at a virtual set in August. So what we're going to do is we're going to have them act on separate days, right? And then we'll stitch it together in some way. We obviously stitch it together editorially, or we can even position them so that we can get two shots. And like, how are you going to make that stuff work? And on one level, it seems utterly devoid of spirit. But on another level, it's just the same as people have been doing the whole time, which is kind of acting, is pretending in front of nothing. So there.
No, it's fascinating. Of course, VO often works like that, right? You often record wild lines and then stitch it together. But I've done a couple of big VO projects, and I usually try to actually get all the actors in a room, just because.
Yeah, that's ideal.
I can't prove that the performances are better, but I'm very confident that they're more enjoyable for the actors, and they're certainly not worse. And it does feel like sometimes you catch a little more something.
I think they are, and they have to be better, because the data if you just want to reduce it to sort of what kind of like response or sort of data is coming back at each actor from the person they're supposed to be with, people are able to modulate what they're doing much more readily. But usually in like VO or animation, people are recording at really different times, and so in a way, the first voice in gets to dictate the sort of tenor of the scene.
Right, because everybody else is listening to that and then giving their.
Yeah, they have to react accordingly.
So one question that came from one of the guys in my play was, like, you're associated, a lot of the work that you're best known for has worked with young actors, right? Coming of age stories, or whether it's American Pie or Twilight or whatever, Golden Compass in a different sense. For them just starting out, are there things that you would look for when casting those kinds of roles, or things that they should be thinking about? Because those are some of the kinds of roles they're likely to be trying for.
Yeah. Well, I think, yes. I think that sort of understanding the difference between theater acting and acting in front of a camera is kind of crucial there, which is like, there is no need to project. Like, there is no need to use your voice as an instrument in the same way. And as well as that's obviously just sort of technical, but this sense that, the size of your performance, like, can just go way, way down. So with kids, it's a different matter entirely, obviously, because you got to sort of wean them of kind of panto acting and the stuff that got them attention and applause when they were doing school plays and things, which is largely about, sort of playing to the back of the room and charming the audience. Like that stuff doesn't really count anymore. And so, so I used to say that a film camera just kind of reads your mind, right? You have to do so little for it to get what it is that you're trying to convey. So just to try to get things smaller and smaller and smaller. There may be a different rule when it comes to like acting in front of something like this, a computer screen. Right. I don't know the principles of it exactly anymore. But I would imagine that again, it's like about the size of performance. Speaking metaphorically, of course, it's like how much you actually have to push to convey what emotion it is that you're talking about. And that really can come from observing the effect. And also, the standards of how big a performance can be changed according to sort of genre and time. Like, the acting of the 50s was very kind of indicating. And then by the time you get to the 70s, we're in a very much more sort of realistic place. And I think we're still there, actually, at least in terms of drama and comedy, being able to say that that performances don't need to go too far to be big performances.
Really interesting. One of my favorite things to watch, have I got her name right? Anna Maxwell, I think it is, the British actress. And even Russell Crowe, in a different way, are very good at letting you read the run of their thoughts without saying anything. And there's a kind of character that you can play on film that's hard to play on stage, who is very interior if you have an actor who you can watch those little gradations travel through. So you can tell they have an inner life even when they're not expressing the inner life.
Yeah, well, exactly. That's almost impossible on stage. If kind of in a close-up, it's amazing the degree to which you can follow somebody's thoughts. For better or worse, you can also see them losing their own focus, let alone the focus of the sort of camera lens. So yeah, that kind of sort of control of the place that your character is occupying, sort of the headspace, for want of a better term, is huge when it comes to film acting.
One of the things that would be fun when this is all over, if you have time sometime, which you probably won't, but I'd love to sit down and we're recording all the performances we're doing of this play. And it'd be fun to actually ask that question. Sit down, record it, and say, here it is. Here we have theater actors, but they're acting for Zoom. It's not film. It's not stage. Yeah. And try to get a sense of where that line falls in performance.
Yeah, I would be interested too, actually, because I haven't thought properly about that until just now. And we were saying, or I was saying, like this may be the future of filmed performance, or the future of screen performance, is something more like Zoom, something that is a combination of sort of live performance and the ability to use multiple viewpoints, rather than like, because maybe I'm just stuck in the present moment, but the idea of going back to a set the way that it was before just seems completely insane at the moment. There's like a DGA white paper on best practices as to how to decontaminate a set and test your crew every day, and different zones of exposure in terms of how people are going to be within 6 feet of one another. But it seems super tricky.
Yep.
So maybe everything's going towards the kind of thing that you're doing.
1 second. Let me follow up one quick thing, and then we've got some questions from the audience. Feel free to pipe those through, Jess. Uh, One of the things you were saying earlier, I know that I started out as a writer, and as anyone who wants to be, I think this is true for a lot of people who want to be in the arts. There's the sense if I'm not out at 2 a.m. drinking absinthe and thinking about cutting off my ear, probably I'm not an artist. Probably I'm not cut out. I don't have whatever that Promethean fire is. And it takes a long time. It took a long time to sort of come home to, for better or for worse, this is who I am and what I've got. And I'm not going to be the Van Gogh type. I always used to sit and think, Shakespeare and Bach, good middle-class people like a beer at the end of the day, pretty stable lives, and somehow they get by. But I think for actors, you're a movie star type actor, but you look and you see over there is the person who can say, do immaculate accents, can do the Meryl Streep or thing. How come I can't do that? And the other person who is that sort of gifted technician who's like, what if I never have enough charisma? And the person who's sort of a comic actor saying, what if no one will ever take me seriously? For people just starting off, I guess my sense with a writer, as a writer, but I don't know if it carries to the actors. I often think about William Faulkner, who started writing novels set in places where important novel things happen, like Paris and London, and they were terrible and no one published them. And he finally sat down and started writing books about Mississippi because he came from Mississippi. And he came home to Yoknapatawpha County. And I wonder if there's something analogous about acting, that you are your instrument and you sort of have to, that needs to be okay, that you're not.
Yeah. Well, so I'm at one remove, of course, because I encounter actors, from the other side of the camera and occasionally in sort of audition settings as well. But I do think I have thought about this, and I would never claim to have figured anything out. But I think the only thing you have any control over eventually is your attention to what you're doing, and the only thing that can probably sustain you in the long run will not be, am I going to sort of succeed or not, or be famous or make a lot of money or whatever, but like, do I love doing this, and does that make it worth it? Especially, and with a lot of actors, it's like, do I love doing this when I'm actually performing? And so they're on stage quite a lot, or what have you, and not just sort of waiting for a movie role or trying to get a movie role. But also, like, do I even like the stuff that goes into being able to do what I'm supposed to be doing, like auditioning or looking over material and figuring out how I'm going to do it. And I would be hard pressed to say that auditioning could ever be fun for anybody, but I do think that as a general principle, the more you can go into an audition feeling like, well, the person opposite me who is in this kind of specious position of being able to, in theory, grant me, give me the rose, grant me the ability to do this thing, reward me with something, is actually just someone trying to do their thing, and I'm doing my thing. And so we're going to work together here. It's not that big a deal. It's not high pressure. I've got my take on it. And if they want to do it, great. And if they don't, then fine. I did what it is that I do. That's like the best. That's the best conditions for an audition, not the sort of high stress thing of like, am I gonna make it or not? Am I gonna get the part or not? Of course you want the part in theory, otherwise you wouldn't be there. But life is long, and it won't really be necessarily about the one thing that you're up for at any one given time. I think the sort of notion that life is long and that careers are long can also be sort of sustaining.
I really, it's it's strangely close to a conversation that I had with my cast a couple of weeks ago about, certainly as a writer, there's a moment fairly early on for me where you have to say, here's success, which is a thing that I want, but I cannot allow what happens with that to poison my relationship with writing. Like,
Yeah.
the business part is important and I will do it, but I can't let either my successes or my failures there creep into poison this, which is the relationship between me and the art I'm trying to create.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is. Like, in some ways, I feel like all the time I'm trying to wake up from this sense that that the things that you get pats on the back for or you get paid for are really the things that you ought to be doing. I mean, there's something aside from that, just like, well, what kind of makes you feel good? And it's the same stuff that made you feel good when you were, coming up with an adventure for Dungeons and Dragons, or playing with your friends, or telling a cool joke, or making something up, and that's the stuff. And the rest of that is some form of I hesitate to call it corruption because it's like, you got to eat. I got 3 kids to put through school and all that kind of good stuff.
Yep.
But it's not that's not the thing. That's not the reason.
So we had a question come in from the audience about film. We're going to keep talking about film, although I note that as
film
authors, we should really talk about books. That's where it's at, but maybe later. So a question from the audience is, what's the biggest difference between working in a film that's largely based on practical effects versus the ones that are heavily CGI? I'm assuming I know you've done plenty of both.
For sure. In so many ways, it's much easier to work in a practical set where actors know what's around them, where they're interacting with actual things. But by the way, even in a practical set, there are 2 different kinds. There's the kind where you're actually working in a practical location, and there are kinds where you're working in a soundstage where it's made up to look like a practical location. And okay, you have all the physical objects and there are walls and all these kinds of things, but you get to place the lights and the cameras and much more. You have much more latitude to move them around, but you still get a sense of artificiality that you have to overcome for the actors. And as much as possible, I think it's great to try to work within practical locations and push as much as you can out of the sort of camera and lighting aspects of it. So that makes it much easier for people to sort of get into the mode of what they're doing. And then there is this other thing, which we're heading towards more and more, which is shooting things in virtual sets. 10 years ago, it was thinking, well, okay, I'm in this practical location, but we're going to paint in this werewolf or whatever, and I've got to get, in this case, Kristen Stewart to react as though a wolf is jumping at her. I speak, of course, to the greatest movie ever made, the Twilight Saga: New Moon.
Don't think we won't be back to New Moon. I have a question all lined up for you.
And at least at the time, Kristen hadn't done, I think, much CGI heavy stuff, and that's not her bag, really. She's very sort of visceral and sort of in the moment. So to try to get those kind of movie moments out of her was a task for her and for me, because you're just sort of imagining your way into this scenario. And short of having a hologram machine, you're really not going to be able to present people with what it is that they're in theory reacting to. Mind you, we're getting closer. So if you do any research about like the system, the digital production system that Panavision is doing, various other sort of digital production means, look at how The Mandalorian was made, right? Where they were finishing sets with entire landscapes and backdrops, and they really would fool you. And those are not painted in after the fact. Those are actually being being put up on screens, which are not then replaced. Those are the actual things that you're going to see, through the lens and on the screen. So you're dealing with these kind of multiple overlapping layers um, of fakeness that you then have to try to act believably in. That's a huge challenge for everybody.
Quick question. I 100% get and believe the value of being on location in a real place. Having said that, I'm guessing somewhere in your time you've had the story of, oh my God, I'm in a location in a real place, and the physical world is very much against me. So what's your Fitzcarraldo moment, if you got one?
Oh man, I guess. Well, you're constantly getting screwed by nature and reality. I can remember just shooting in a field that one day was green, and the next morning to finish the scene, you arrive and it's covered in snow, and you're just basically screwed. And you try to think of something else to shoot. I mean, in a weird way, that's part of the fun of making movies with the constraints of practical production, like on some level. And maybe this will all change. Like maybe it's changing right now that the factors that you don't have control over kind of can make for some really great puzzle solving. And obviously there are like a number of creative solutions that you can always come up with, which end up being better than if you could have done anything you wanted to. I think that there are plenty of examples in like Hollywood movies of the last 5 or 10 years of being able to do anything on screen, kind of making things not matter at all, in terms of just CGI heavy productions.
Yeah, I'm not going to ask you to name them, but I think we can all have our private list.
Well, it may not have been necessary to do every single J.R.R. Tolkien book, but I think, a counterexample where you think like, wow, the practical nature of this shoot, Mad Max Fury Road, right? So much of that being practical, and CG generally being used to kind of gild the lily. It just made it into a near perfect movie.
Very interesting. Okay, so we were prepping yesterday before we leave Twilight entirely. I happen to know that among your many awards and honors, you won the MTV Movie Award for Best Kiss for Twilight. Yes. And on discussion, the question came up, what is the balance? Like how many smacking it's the noise. People were really interested in how you titer the sound of the smooch to get the perfect smoochiness.
I think that's all post like sound design, right?
No, really?
I don't know. Well, I mean, maybe it was like Foley, and you actually used like you waxed two salmon against each other or something to create that sound. I always like how you create like the effect of someone being punched by slapping a steak on a slab of marble or something like that.
The idea that best kiss was the sound effect was some sound engineer named Mort, who's 53 and took a cigarette out of his mouth and and then, oh, that's good. I'm just going to sweeten a little.
I'm not sure if that's the case, but I really hope it is.
All right.
I have a question quickly before
yes.
move on from that, which is just something we got from the audience that personally I would like to know the answer to. Team Edward or Team Jacob?
Oh, for me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Let me see. Well, my get out of jail answer for that was always Team Bella, but I think I'm a Jacob essentially. I'm not cool enough to be Team Edward.
Yeah.
I think I'm with Tay and Team Jacob.
No.
I think that's where the chat is sitting at the moment. So I think you're on the right
Oh,
side of the
yeah,
chat.
There you go, Steph.
The numbers are in. Good. Polling. It's polling well.
Yep, Chloe's mum is very happy. Our technical assistant, her mum is one of our biggest fans on Twitch, and she's quite the icon.
Excellent.
With us.
Excellent. I'm glad I made her happy.
Subscriber number one. You got to keep subscriber number one happy.
Yep.
So, young adult stuff. This is something you come back to. Like, it's American Pie and it's Twilight. And you also wrote an entire YA trilogy.
Yep.
Of books. Why? What is it about that you find keeps you coming back to that time or place?
Well, it's tricky. I mean, actually, I think it's a bit circumstantial. American Pie was the first movie that they would let me and my brother direct. So that's the answer to that. Much as we loved it and had a great experience doing it, it wasn't necessarily kind of central. Like, I never went to prom. I didn't go to American high school. I went to sixth form in England. And then let me see, New Moon. I liked those actors. I like working with young actors in general because they tend to trust me more than experienced people who know what they're doing. So, and then I think I wrote. Well, first of all, actually, I do think there is something about young adult books, which is that they're not afraid to take on the big issues, right? They're not kind of stuck up their own butts with the concerns of literary fiction, which is basically, it's usually, civilization is discontents, or should I cheat on my spouse? And, young adult fiction is like, are we going to bring down the government? Is there a vast conspiracy trying to destroy me? Am I the chosen one? Which is just much more fun. So I think I was after I did the Twilight movie, I was being sent a lot of YA stuff, some of which was great and some of which wasn't. I thought, well, I can just do my own, and that was then the next 3 years of my life. And it turns out writing books is really hard, and I don't want to do it again. But by the time, but I didn't know that when I went out and got a contract to write a trilogy. And by the end, I just had to finish it.
So you've made a professional novelist very happy. Like, there are bittersweet parts of that, but I have a friend who's a writer. His dad was a surgeon, and one of the things about writing is that because we all speak and because we all have to write some, everybody is pretty confident that if they just took a little time, in a way that nobody
they
says,
got a book in them.
I haven't sat down at that grand piano, but I'm sure if I wanted to, I could play Shostakovich. So I have this friend who's a writer. His dad was a cardiac surgeon, and he was at the family home. I guess he would have been in his late 20s or early 30s, and his father's sort of set in their 60s of doctors, some younger, some older. And so he struck up a conversation with someone who was there as one of his father's acquaintances. And the guy said, "What do you do?" And he said, "I'm a writer." And I said, "That's amazing, because I'm just taking a year off my practice to write." And my friend, who is a little waspy, said, "That's incredible, because I'm taking a year off writing to do heart surgery." And then an embarrassing, awkward silence.
Yeah, that probably didn't go over too well. Yeah, I think it's a brutal experience of oneself to write a novel, and yeah, I don't want to go back there. Don't make me go back. I used to say, like when you're writing a screenplay, it has to be sort of like 100 pages maybe, and you can always just you could just always just pad things out by half a page by having someone say, "What did you say?" and then someone repeats themselves. And if you do enough of that, you've done your 5 pages for the day.
So, a question that we had that sort of segues naturally from that was, I mean, I know from talking to you that you do read a lot, and you did read a lot, and books have been important to you. One of the things you've done a lot, and I know it's also a condition of the industry, but you've done a lot of adaptations. Twilight is one, Golden Compass is one, About a Boy is one. How do you, what are the things that feel different, or what are the interesting things you've learned when you're in the role of an adapter as opposed to creating an original screenplay?
Right. Well, I think that's actually, I think, probably the thing that I do that is closest to acting, which is you're sort of trying to imagine yourself into somebody else's head and the context of someone else's story, and sort of behave naturally in someone else's skin. I've taken to calling it like method writing, and I've done it also with the script that I was writing, which was about rowing, right? And so for a little while, I trained under this guy who was a world championship rower. I wanted to know what it was like. I guess what you would do if you were training to be an actor, but I needed to understand what these characters were facing. And that was an adaptation of a nonfiction book. And it was miserable, but I do think.
Were you doing The Boys in the Boat?
Yeah, Boys in the Boat. Yeah, which has still sadly not been made, but is a pretty great story.
And what you've discovered about rowing is that it's the most painful form of athletic exercise known to man, basically.
It is the worst. It is. It's sheer hell. But understanding that was actually crucial to my being able to, I think, to write it, which was that that there was this kind of huge psychological burden on these rowers, physical and psychological burden, which is it makes it unlike any other sport. But so I think adapting things, you want to get into the spirit of a book enough that if you're writing dialogue for a character, it should naturally feel as though that was dialogue from the book, even if it isn't. That you and that later you might go back and not know or remember or discern whether it was dialogue taken directly from the book or dialogue that you invented. I mean, of course, there's a lot of a film being essentially a 2-hour experience, and a book and reading a book being something more like 30 hours. There's a huge amount of compression that takes place, and you're constantly committing these sort of acts of violence on the story and the timeline, and how to do that in such a way that you're not sort of killing the sort of spirit of what you're doing is key. So yeah, I mean, I've done so many adaptations because really, for me, leaving university with an English degree, it was a way to stay in contact with books. So like making movies for me is a lot about staying in touch with what I like about books. And sometimes that turns out well, and sometimes that does not. Like Golden Compass being a case in point that the spirit of it did not survive the process of being turned into a 2-hour film. It might have, had it been a 3-hour film. That was my intention, but that film was never going to see the light of day, unfortunately, given the sort of context that it was made in.
Interesting. That's fascinating. I don't know if that's something you want to talk any more about, or if you feel like you've sort of said your piece, but
well, it may not be central to the concerns of this particular audience, but it was for a big American studio to make a book based on essentially an atheist an atheist response to C.S. Lewis was never going to make sense. All the things that it had to say about organized religion and about how children are treated in a kind of an autocratic society, we're just not gonna mix with the demands of putting out a big blockbuster by the studio that had put out Lord of the Rings.
Right. Very interesting. That's a conversation we'll follow up sometime when we've got a little more time. I'm aware that it would be criminal not to talk at least a little bit about Star Wars because it's Twitch and it's Rogue One. As you can see, I'm rocking Darth. After I wrote my Star Wars book, my family got me this T-shirt because also I'm a gardener, so it seemed to fit.
It's great. Now, is that like Darth in his retirement, remembering?
Yeah, he's making a little topiary.
Yeah.
I don't know if you can tell. It's a potted plant.
Yeah.
It's pruning. So I suspect I had a lot of latitude, comparatively speaking. Like you have to color inside the lines when you're writing a Star Wars book, but it's a book. I'm assuming that the level of scrutiny on a Star Wars movie is off the charts. And one of the things that astonished me is, without having a spoiler for people who haven't seen the film, the end of that movie is not a traditional Star Wars ending, although
right.
I think it fits nicely in the spirit of Star Wars. But I was astonished walking out of the theater that you got to do that. And I was just wondering what kind of negotiation goes into making that kind of decision and getting the backing to make it.
Well, I was surprised that we were able to get away with it as well. And I think that the first kind of draft of it, they hadn't, Gary Whitta and Gareth Edwards, Gary being my predecessor as screenwriter, had kind of contemplated a very dark ending, but never thought that Disney would never approve of it. Because you don't see those characters anywhere else or even hear them, in fact, anywhere else in the other movies, it was, first of all, you could sort of narratively justify it. And really, sometimes it just comes down to whether the guy who can put his thumb up or down does it, or the woman who can do that. In this case, it was a guy. It was Alan Horn, who was like, well, I guess we got to do this. So we were able to. Yeah, it was a cool. It was cool to be able to feel like that. That's sort of the big thing that I got across the plate, probably. I could point to 100 lines of dialogue that I miss, but yeah, that was fun.
I'm assuming that what was in your head was sort of the great World War II movies, right? Great Escape or Magnificent Seven or Bridge over the River Kwai or
Guns of Navarone, which maybe isn't one of the great ones, but that kind of thing.
No.
Or, Bridge Too Far,
Bridge Too Far, right.
Yeah, and also I think probably the war that was more in George Lucas's mind was the Vietnam War when he was coming up with the original. So there is some Apocalypse Now in there as well.
Interesting.
And and actually there was even more Apocalypse Now before it got to the screen. So there was a lot of there was a scene that was really a direct callback to the moment in Apocalypse Now where they're telling Martin Sheen that they want to have Kurtz assassinated, kind of a smoky room CIA kind of moment. But yeah, I think there was a notion of these classic war movies, of heist movies, sort of team of misfits sort of thing.
One of the questions from the chat was, like, I normally think of writers as, thanks very much, we would like never to hear from you again. Once they were shooting, like when Gareth Edwards was making the movie, do you ever I had a question. Did you ever get shown things, or would they ever sort of give you a call and say,
No.
"What do you think?" That's
No,
that's my understanding.
because sometimes that happens on normal movies, but with Star Wars, the security is so high that like once your badge has been turned in, we'll see you at the premiere, basically. Although I did go to the set for about a week, by which time I was no longer writing on it. It had been handed over to other hands because I had stuck in the States when they were going to shoot in London. But then it's kind of actually when you watch a movie like that in the process of shooting, you'd be hard pressed to actually understand what the hell's going on because it's happening at such a rate of such minuscule parts of the whole that you don't really get to see the whole of any scene or the development of any piece of narrative. It's being done in pieces.
Really?
Yeah. So because of course there's not really any CGI. There's very little, there's some practical effects, but so much of it is going to be painted in. It's 100 and something day shoot, so you're probably seeing, at most 1 minute, like 1 minute's worth of screen time a day would be a big day. So you're not seeing much.
So you're, in some senses, in a funny way, if you're on set watching actors, they are in a different sense just plates. It's like shooting plates, and it's the CGI guys who are going to be.
They're kind of elements, they're elements like others. I mean, if you're a good director and careful like Gareth is, and you care about sort of the sense of verite, which he does, then you could see. I also happened to arrive at a time which was kind of a very stunt heavy shoot. Part of the shoot, it was this big sort of Imperial weapons platform. And so there wasn't really much going on that I could get my head around. I think I saw some good Ben Mendelsohn stuff when he's yammering about how great the Death Star is. But other than that, there was just a lot of sitting around waiting. And so really the first time I got a sense of what the movie was going to be like was at the premiere, which was fantastic because I got the dual experience of seeing a movie that I'd worked on, but also a Star Wars movie that had new things for me that I liked. So that was cool.
As I said on Twitter, and I've told you before, Rogue One is the first Star Wars movie I walked out of with no feelings of disappointment since 1980. And I thought about that. I was like, man, it feels like a long time. And then I counted up the years, and I was like, damn.
Yeah, that feeling. Well, thanks.
We all, I guess, seize a moment sometimes to retcon things. They asked me to write a book about Yoda, so
yeah,
I used my opportunity to reset Yoda back to the Yoda from Empire Strikes Back, as opposed to whatever he had sort of drifted towards.
Which is why I liked which is great because that's the best Yoda. And
it is the best Yoda.
I liked that they brought back Puppet Yoda for Last Jedi. No, Last Jedi. Wait, Last Jedi? Yes, Last Jedi. I get all the names get confusing to me after a while. They turn into a bit of a mush.
And the fact that the first one is number 4 just makes it hopeless.
It's really a high bar to clear in terms of making sense of it.
One of the questions that someone else asked is just, what's it like to come in partway through a franchise? Like, you were doing the 10th or 11th Star Wars film, you were doing the second Twilight movie, and we've just, obviously, I don't want to wander into any controversy and explicitly with the last 3 Star Wars movies. Let's just say it's not always easy. Handling that pass off from what's been done previously.
Well, it was great that it was a standalone in a way, and it was also so when they call and say we're thinking of you as a writer for a Star Wars movie, they don't tell you what it's going to be until you're in the room, and then after you sign multiple NDAs, tell you what it's about. So I didn't know what it was going to be when I finally got the call, having waited for 35 years of my life to write a Star Wars movie.
Right.
You know, and I was so relieved that it was the opening crawl. More than relieved, I was super excited because that was the thing that first got me into it. So I felt like I had been preparing to do this for my whole life. It was exactly what I wanted to do. And so I was really in the pocket very, very quickly, right? I didn't have to, because I knew exactly where I was in terms of the timeline
Right.
and the sort of mythos and what mattered at that point. So it was great. You know, there's a lot of pressure in terms of, because let me see, J.J. Abrams' first Star Wars hadn't come out yet. Force Awakens hadn't come out yet when we started working on this. And so, was it all going to work? You know, were people going to still be into it? Had the prequel sort of left a bad taste in people's mouths? How are we going to sort of, if so, how are we going to, you know, get away from that, get back to what was great, also chart a path to the future, all that kind of stuff? Were the fans going to like it? Were they going to hate us forever? All that kind of stuff kind of comes into it, of course. But the only possible way to forge ahead is to have a sort of sense of like your connection to Star Wars. Fortunately, I had it, you know, since I was 7 years old, so it felt right. I felt reasonably confident.
So you saw it in theaters then, because I did this math and I worked out that you must have been 7. I was 11.
Yeah. Yeah, it galvanized me. It really changed my life because I was still at an age where I didn't think of a movie as a sort of this kind of discrete corporate product that you stack up next to 2,000 other experiences like it you've had, but it was this kind of special moment where I was just utterly transported. And I think it's hard to arrive at that same feeling these days, you know, if you're a kid, because you already know that Star Wars is this thing and you're familiar with the whole iconography and the corporate sort of monetization of it in various forms. And then if you see Star Wars for the first time, it doesn't have that same sense of sacredness, for want of a better term, that it had for me when I saw it.
Right. When we were little boys and you just walked in having no idea other than maybe it would be cool. And then that happened, you know.
Yeah.
Seven's the age at which I read The Lord of the Rings. And that is what happened to me. That's why I turned out to be this guy. But certainly Star Wars was the cinema equivalent. I know what my favorite movies are. Really like the Disney Jungle Book. I remember that. It had a cool fox and he fired a bow. I'm in. But Star Wars was the closest cinematic equivalent to my Lord of the Rings experience of like,
right. I mean, I knew that there was such a thing as actors, and that, so, you know, that wasn't actually Luke Skywalker, that was Mark Hamill, all that stuff. Like I wasn't, I didn't, but at the same time, on some other level, I was taking it on as some kind of reality that really mattered to me. And I think that's still true of any sort of artistic experience you have. You know, obviously somebody painted this, somebody wrote this, somebody, you know, put this stuff on television, and they're doing it so that you buy the stuff in the commercials, or, you know, you buy the popcorn or whatever. But at the same time, you are submitting yourself to this really extraordinary experience. Yeah.
When I was working on the Yoda book, I was at first like, well, I got to pay my rent, and I like Star Wars, and I like Yoda. There's fun things you could do about that. And then I started thinking about the nature of the task, and I had 4 months to write the book. We may have had this conversation. If so, I apologize. But I had 4 months to write the book, and I began to think about, there is a substantial number of people in the world. There's never been a book about Yoda specifically. And there are a reasonable number of Star Wars fans who do not go to church, you know, who do not have a rabbi or a minister. And they're going to come home one day when, you know, their mom gets a diagnosis, or their girlfriend leaves them, or some shattering life event happens, and they're going to ask Yoda, they're going to look at this character for whatever it is that keeps you going, because Yoda fills that slot for a certain number of people. And the more I thought about it, the more terrifying a responsibility it seemed like. And I was like, okay, I should have tried to negotiate for any other character or any other part of the thing. But this story has to work as a Star Wars story, but at some level, it also needs to function as wisdom literature. Like, it's got to have something for people who come there when things have absolutely gone dark for them, and they need someone to speak to that. So it was, in one way, the most heavy responsibility I've had as a writer.
That's interesting. Yeah, I was thinking that kind of thing about, say, you look at like Avengers, Infinity War, Endgame, and on one level, of course, like as I'm watching, I'm like, oh, this is a big bunch of hooey about a bunch of guys in funny costumes who go around punching each other. But also, like as I'm watching it, I'm kind of moved at the end when like Black Panther shows up through the swirly gate to fight Thanos. And it can operate on both of those levels, which maybe also brings you back to acting, which is like the responsibility that you have in portraying, in empathizing, and trying to evoke empathy for the characters that you're portraying.
I think those kinds of stories, right? The Ramayana looks a lot like Avengers Endgame. The Norse sagas look like that. Mahabharata, like that's the Epic of Gilgamesh. That's what storytelling that moves everyone has always looked like, in a funny way. We're just nearly at the end, and I've been given a last question. Oh, sorry, 2 quick last questions. 1, gaming. Most important game for you over the course of your life?
Are we talking about, does it just have to be video games or games?
Nope. Any kind of.
Okay.
You could say Pinnacle.
Dungeons and Dragons, easy. Because I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing if I hadn't sort of been a dungeon master and sort of enjoyed coming up with these kind of these worlds that had to be on some level internally consistent, and then where I had to take into account the audience, and they were also interactive, of course. So yeah, absolutely, being able to immerse myself into that game.
So let's see if we can artfully segue from there. 100% the same answer for me. I wouldn't do what I was doing if it hadn't been for all the RPGs I played, from starting at Dungeons and Dragons and going on from there. The question to you was, how do you envision the future of film, and might it merge with this new theater? And I actually think that's related to the Dungeons and Dragons question. And maybe the sense that you're not just throwing a story at an audience, but somehow working with them.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I think the future of cinema or movies, as I grew up learning to make them, is pretty bleak, right? Because people don't want to go. They didn't want to go out to movie theaters anymore, even before it became a risk to your life. And those had to be justified then by a huge spectacle, which cost so much that people, couldn't afford to tell sort of human scale stories on a big screen. So then, things were heading towards streaming and screen. But once you get onto screens, then you can start talking about the possible interactivity that's available to you in terms of what you guys are doing, and of course that is parallel with this this notion that you don't need gatekeepers to the same degree, right? Obviously, the studios were the biggest gatekeepers to what was supposed to be mass entertainment, and is in part because these things were so expensive. But once you can start doing things on a level of budget that isn't quite so prohibitive, then you can do all kinds of interesting forms of screen entertainment. And the interactivity obviously has a point at which it breaks. Like, you could imagine a certain degree of response with an audience that has a few choices and actors who can respond accordingly, but you can't have an audience of 1 million and each person gets to sort of democratically have their own version of the story come on. So there's always going to be a storyteller, I think, and a story told. But the degree of responsivity may change.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really smart.
Oh, thanks.
I feel well. It's not surprising. I didn't act astonished. But I think we're at time. Checking covertly to my producers, and they say yes. Chris, thank you so much. I think that was a super interesting conversation, and it was very generous of you to give your time. And
thank you, Sean. Thank you all for listening. Really, really fun. It was really fun. Great conversation.
All right. Thanks so much, man. I'll let him cut us off.
Bye-bye,
everyone. We'll see you all shortly. We tune in weekly, daily, at 11 a.m. as always, and we'll be right back here. And we start production 4th of August, so see you then. Until then, thank you, Chris, for joining us. Thank you, Sean, Jess, and Daniel. And we'll see you all next week, Monday at 11 a.m. as always. See you all.
Bye-bye. Thanks. See you guys. Thanks so much. Stay safe. Stay well. Don't do drugs. I don't know.
And do it one more time for me.
Oh, I take my jumper off. It's not helping. Omega switch pat. Install. Whoa. I'm packed.
That's pretty good, right?
That's the best thing I've ever seen you do, Lee.
That was great.
Anyway, there were these people there watching us. And they were, watching the stream and talking about us.
What did they say?
Oh, dude, just like